Picture a convoy of grey steel hulls cutting through a frozen ocean. The water is black, the ice is white. Above it all, a bleached horizon where sky and snow merge into a single pale line. The ships move forward under a sky so bright it erases shadows. This is Antarctica, late summer of 1946. The air is thin. The light is relentless. Somewhere in the archives, grainy 16mm newsreel footage captures this moment. The departure, the scale, the official weight of it. Somewhere else, in late-night forums and pulpy paperbacks, other voices have woven a different story around these same ships, these same men. The question we carry into this hour is simple. Where does one story end and the other begin?
Welcome to Unexplained History. I'm Tom Sims. In each episode, we step into moments where the official record meets rumor, where facts blur into folklore, and where a single expedition can spawn a dozen competing narratives. What you'll hear today is an investigation into how that happens, and what it tells us about truth, belief, and the power of a name.
Listen to what circulates online, in certain corners of the internet and in whispered recollections. Some claim that Admiral Richard E. Byrd led a massive naval task force south in the summer of 1946 and encountered something extraordinary. The story goes that his fleet was driven back, that hidden bases existed. That flying craft, unconventional, perhaps even extraterrestrial, forced a retreat. That his mission, officially titled the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, was actually something else entirely. A cover. A failure hidden under bureaucratic language.
But here's where we pause.
The official record is clear on one point. Task Force 68 departed United States ports on August 26, 1946. It was a Navy operation. It was enormous. Thousands of personnel, multiple ships, aircraft, research equipment. It concluded in late February 1947. All of that is documented. But between the departure and the conclusion, between the official logs and the public imagination, space opened up. Space where rumor could take root. And at the center of that space stood a single name: Byrd. His reputation preceded him. He was polar explorer, naval officer, a man who had flown over the North Pole, who had commanded research stations, who embodied a certain heroic authority. When his name was attached to Antarctica, people listened. When whispers began to attach his name to the extraordinary, people believed.
Richard found himself carrying weight he may never have intended to carry.
The burden of expectation settled on him. Public perception had already begun to link his legacy to claims far beyond what the mission itself could support. He would spend years, frustrated, increasingly vocal, trying to defend what he had actually done, only to watch his own words get folded into the very narratives he was trying to correct. His public image became a vessel for speculation. He was both the hero of the expedition and the enigma at its center, and he had limited control over which version people chose to believe. The question at the heart of this segment, and the beginning of our investigation, is this: how does a large official military expedition transform into a tale about hidden bases and exotic craft? Where exactly does the boundary between archive and invention lie?
When we talk about Operation Highjump, we're really talking about one of the largest military expeditions ever mounted to Antarctica. But understanding what happened means understanding what was actually supposed to happen. So, let's look at the numbers and the mission itself. The official reasons Admiral Richard E. Byrd assembled such a massive force in 1946.
The year is 1946, just months after the end of the Second World War. The geopolitical landscape is shifting fast. The United States and the Soviet Union are beginning to view each other differently, less as allies, more as competitors for influence and resources. Antarctica, remote and largely unexplored, suddenly matters in this new calculation. The Navy draws up ambitious plans. They will establish a major base, Little America IV, on the continent. They will train personnel in extreme cold weather operations, something the military knows it will need. And they will conduct aerial mapping and scientific observation across vast territories that remain poorly charted. To accomplish all of this, they assembled Task Force 68. The numbers are substantial. Roughly 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. That is not a small scientific expedition. That is a military operation with real logistics, real firepower, real complexity. The creaking steel hulls grind into pack ice. Naval grey uniforms move across frozen decks. Enamel coffee cups circulate among men learning how to survive where few have succeeded before.
Why does the military need to scale up that much just to map a continent?
Because Antarctica is unforgiving. Cold weather training isn't classroom theory. It's hands-on survival in conditions where mistakes kill people. You need enough personnel to rotate through harsh assignments, to maintain bases, to fly reconnaissance missions, to handle emergencies when they happen. You need backup for your backup. Aerial mapping requires sustained flight operations across thousands of miles of white terrain where visual landmarks disappear. All of this demands infrastructure and manpower. Admiral Richard Byrd understood these demands intimately. He had commanded polar operations before. His reputation and his standing with the Navy gave him the credibility to ask for and receive the resources he needed. He also understood public expectation. Byrd was famous. When he spoke, Americans listened. So he engaged more directly with the press to explain what the expedition would accomplish, trying to shape how the public received news from Antarctica. But Byrd was also aware that larger narratives stick to spectacular endeavors. He knew his operational choices would influence how people understood the mission afterward. That awareness would matter, because years later, when people began to reinterpret what happened in Antarctica, they reached for frameworks that turned training accidents into something far more dramatic. The gap between what the logbooks recorded and what readers wanted to believe proved fertile ground for speculation.
The stated goals were clear: cold weather training, scientific observation, establishing a base. But given that mission and that scale, why did people later read a battle into what the logs actually recorded as training? On the 30th of December, 1946, something happened during Operation Highjump that would shape how people talk about the expedition for decades. A patrol bomber crashed near Thurston Island, and the details of what followed and what stayed hidden tell us a lot about how accidents become mysteries. This is the story of that day, and what it meant for the people who were there.
The PBM Mariner was a twin-engine flying boat, bulky, loud, and built to handle rough conditions. The Navy was using them for patrol work across the Antarctic, scanning vast stretches of ice and ocean. On that December morning, one of these aircraft, call sign George 1, took off from Little America IV. At the base, tents snapped in the rising wind. Canvas and fuel drums dotted the frozen landscape. Men worked in layers of wool and fur. Radio operators waited for check-ins. And somewhere over the ice shelf, the Mariner was beginning to fail. Mechanical trouble, engine strain. The kind of thing that happened out here, where the cold worked against every piece of machinery. The aircraft went down near Thurston Island. Multiple people died in the crash. The Navy documented casualties. Rescue teams mobilized. But in a place so remote, with communications so sparse, the full details never reached the public with the clarity they deserved.
Richard Byrd was the expedition commander, and he carried the weight of those losses.
Byrd worked through Navy channels to ensure the casualty reports were accurate. He wanted the truth on record, not for the press, but for the families, and for history. Yet tragedy had already created a gap, a vacuum. When something terrible happens in a remote place, and details are slow to emerge, people fill the silence with questions. And in the years that followed, some of those questions became something else entirely. The crash was documented as an accident. The extreme Antarctic conditions, the mechanical stresses, the limitations of 1940s technology, all of it pointed to a simple and tragic explanation. But decades later, people who had never seen those official reports began to tell different stories. They suggested the aircraft had been brought down by something else, something unknown. This is how documented accidents transform. They enter the space between what we know and what we fear. Grief and secrecy and limited information become soil in which speculation grows. The difference between an accident and something sinister matters to the families who lost people that day, and to our understanding of what really happened.
So, when later accounts began to circulate, claiming that Byrd and his team had encountered something extraordinary, something that forced them to retreat, where did those stories really come from? The post-war years brought a hunger for wonder. New technologies seemed possible. And once a story entered the newsreel, once it was repeated on the radio, it began to change. How does a documented military expedition become something altogether different in the public imagination?
It's 1950. The Second World War has ended. Rationing continues at home. People crave something larger than themselves. A reason to believe that the future holds secrets, that science will deliver marvels. In this climate, pulp magazines and alternative newspapers began circulating. They picked up fragments of the Highjump expedition. They wove them into something new. Admiral Richard E. Byrd had given public statements about his work. He spoke to journalists. He recorded interviews. But in print, those words began to shift. Passages were excerpted. Context dissolved. A statement about unusual weather conditions became a claim about advanced craft. A routine encounter became a combat. The more the story was handled by editors seeking sales, the further it drifted from what Byrd had actually said.
Did Byrd himself fuel any of this?
In the early years, Richard was cautious but willing to engage with journalists. But later, as the stories grew wilder, he distanced himself. There was no evidence he promoted conspiracies about secret bases or alien contact.
Now, we meet the people who kept this story alive. Not all of them were trying to deceive. Some were genuinely curious. Others saw in Byrd's expedition a chance to answer questions that official channels seemed reluctant to touch. But how do we sort fact from amplification when the loudest voices aren't always the most reliable?
In the years after Operation Highjump concluded in early 1947, a peculiar machinery began to turn. Press teletype machines clattered in newsrooms from Washington to Los Angeles. Admirals gave interviews, reporters filed stories, and somewhere in that churn of paper and ink, fact and speculation became difficult to separate. Richard E. Byrd was perhaps the most celebrated polar explorer of his era. His achievements were genuine. He had flown over both poles, commanded massive expeditions, earned respect from the Navy and the public alike. He was also, by temperament, a man accustomed to telling his own story. In March 1947, he sat for a public interview with a journalist named Lee Van Atter. That conversation was documented. It was real. But what Byrd actually said in that moment, and what others claimed he said afterward, would eventually diverge in troubling ways.
What did Byrd actually reveal during that time?
The official record shows Byrd discussed the expedition's scientific achievements, the challenge in weather, the loss of a few aircraft. What he did not do was claim the fleet had been attacked or driven away by hostile forces. Yet within years, other writers and researchers began circulating claims that Byrd had made far more sensational statements. Reports of enemy vessels in the Antarctic, of combat encounters, of a massive coordinated retreat. These accounts appeared in books, in newsletters, on websites marked as unverified or popular sources. None traced back to Byrd's actual documented words. The people who spread these stories were not simply liars. Many were true believers. They saw gaps in the official narrative and assumed those gaps concealed something extraordinary. They felt Byrd's celebrity gave weight to their interpretations. They didn't realize they were doing the reverse. They were using Byrd's name to lend authority to claims he had never made. And as those claims circulated further, they hardened into apparent fact. Byrd himself became something of a prisoner to this process. His own words were treated with suspicion by some researchers, who insisted his real statements must be hidden elsewhere. His family and colleagues later grew protective of his written record, concerned that every fragment of his correspondence might be reinterpreted through a lens of conspiracy. The more his reputation became tangled with speculation, the harder it became to separate the man from the myth. Rear Admiral Richard H. commanded the ships at sea during the expedition. Byrd coordinated the technical and scientific work. Together, they compiled reports. They documented conditions. They recorded losses. All of this exists in archives, in Navy files, in correspondence that can still be requested and read today.
The question becomes, when someone tells you a compelling story, especially one that feels like it fills a gap in history, what makes you trust it? And what should? When faced with a compelling story, how do you separate authoritative testimony from amplified rumor? We've just heard from the people who spread the myth of Operation Highjump. Now it's time to turn to something harder, the actual records. What do the documents really say, and how do we read them fairly?
The real work of history happens quietly. It happens in archives, in the soft scratch of pages being turned, in the careful notation of dates and sources. It happens in the click of a camera shutter capturing a ship's log from 70 years ago. When you want to know what Admiral Richard E. Byrd actually encountered in Antarctica, you don't start with YouTube videos or best-selling books. You start here, with the Army Observer's Report, filed in 1947. You start with the Navy technical documents and the ship deck logs that recorded each day's operations, hour by hour. These records exist. Many have been digitized. The National Library of Medicine and the Internet Archive hold copies. The Navy Historical Heritage Command maintains photographic collections with detailed metadata, information about when each photo was taken, who took it, and what it shows. If you want to know whether the fleet was truly defeated in combat, as some claim, this is where you look.
Walk us through what those documents actually contain.
The Army Observer's Report details the expedition day by day. It describes objectives, weather conditions, personnel movements, aircraft sorties. The language is dry, formal, military. There are no wild claims. The ship logs are even more granular. They record times, positions, equipment malfunctions, crew activities. They show what Richard and his team were doing at specific moments when extraordinary events supposedly occurred. When you read the two side by side, the log entry and the observer's account, inconsistencies emerge, or sometimes confirmations. The photographs matter just as much. A Navy photo stamped with a date and a caption tells you when and where something happened. But captions can be misread. A small transcription error, a single misplaced digit or a vague location name, can create enormous interpretive gaps. Our team requested original files from the Navy archives. We cross-checked captions against ship positions. We matched photo dates to log entries. That's how you separate rumor from record. Richard himself understood the power of primary sources. Late in his life, he encouraged historians and researchers to rely on what he called the actual papers, not hearsay, not legend, but the documents themselves. He supported the digitization of his own archives because he believed the truth would hold up under scrutiny. That belief prompted wider public access to Navy records and expedition files. Today, a student in any country can download these documents and read them.
So, when we ask what the deck logs and the Army Observer's Report actually show, day by day, what do they reveal? So far, we've looked at what the archives tell us, the official records, the declassified files, the careful footprint of history. But here's the thing about a mystery this compelling. The evidence on paper doesn't always settle it for everyone. Some people remain convinced despite what the documents show, and their reasons are deeply human. So let's listen to why this story endures.
In the decades after 1947, a particular set of quotes about Admiral Richard E. Byrd began circulating in magazines, newsletters, and later across the early internet. These weren't from his official expedition logs or published interviews. They appeared in alternative publications, pulp magazines and post-war occult journals that claimed to have inside knowledge. They described Byrd encountering vast underground civilizations, aircraft that could traverse from pole to pole, zones that governments wanted hidden from the public. Scholars and archivists who studied Byrd's actual papers, his diaries, his correspondence, his expedition records, found no trace of these dramatic statements. The quotes seemed to be fabricated or pulled from sources Byrd never sat for, but that didn't matter to the people who had already woven them into their understanding of what really happened in Antarctica.
Why wouldn't it matter?
Because belief operates on a different logic than archival proof. For people drawn to these narratives, Byrd became a repository for a much larger feeling, that powerful forces move behind closed doors, that were kept in the dark about transformative discoveries, that authority figures cannot be trusted to tell us the truth. The Admiral's name lent weight and legitimacy to ideas that would otherwise seem implausible. His stature made the impossible feel plausible. What matters is not whether Byrd actually said these things. What matters is that they circulate, that they feel true, that they answer a longing in people who sense a gap between official explanations and lived experience. The myth about him, The idea that he discovered forbidden zones and made contact with inner Earth inhabitants became independent of what he actually wrote or testified.
These claims keep getting republished, reframed, passed along.
They do. Each retelling adds texture and authority. Communities form around shared belief in these narratives. Online forums, discussion groups, and niche publishing keep the story alive and growing. For believers, the consistency of the retelling becomes its own kind of evidence. If so many people are saying this, the reasoning goes, there must be something to it. And when archivists and scholars try to clarify what Byrd actually said, that effort itself can be reinterpreted as institutional gatekeeping, proof that the establishment wants the truth suppressed. The more the official record contradicts the popular story, the more the popular story seems to need defending. Identity becomes tied to belief. People who have invested emotional and social energy into these ideas find community and meaning there. Walking away means losing that sense of belonging, that feeling of knowing something others don't.
So what happens when the archive is clear, but belief persists anyway? How do we make sense of that gap? We've heard why believers hold tight to these stories. Now we're turning to the scientists and historians who've spent years testing the claims. What can rigorous evidence actually tell us about what Admiral Richard E. Byrd found in Antarctica? Let's start with the most fundamental question. Did Byrd discover something extraordinary, or was he simply doing his job?
The problem with testing the hollow Earth claim is that it leaves very little room for ambiguity. A hollow planet isn't a small mystery we can debate in the margins. Geophysicists have tools now that can measure the interior structure of Earth itself. Seismic waves travel through rock differently than they travel through air or empty space. When earthquakes strike anywhere on the globe, sensors pick up those shock waves. The waves bend, slow, and speed up as they pass through different layers. That data has been collected for over a century. It tells us Earth has a dense iron core, a hot mantle, and a rocky crust. There is no room inside for habitable caverns or civilizations. The math doesn't work, the physics doesn't work.
So what would it take to change that conclusion?
Here's where the scientific method becomes clear. If the seismic data was somehow wrong, if decades of measurements from thousands of stations worldwide all pointed to a hollow structure, then yes, we would have to reconsider. But that hasn't happened. Instead, we have the opposite. Every new measurement reinforces what we already know. Now, on the historical side, polar historians have traced Byrd's operational records. In 1947, the United States Navy launched Operation Highjump, an enormous expedition with ships, aircraft, and hundreds of personnel. Byrd led reconnaissance flights across Antarctica. He brought back photographs, flight logs, and weather observations. The following year, Operation Windmill returned to the same region to provide ground control and verify what the aerial mapping had captured. They established Little America IV on the Ross Ice Shelf and continued systematic surveys. Historians have studied Byrd's diaries, his radio dispatches, and his official reports. If Byrd had witnessed inner Earth inhabitants or passages, those records should contain evidence. They don't. What we find instead are detailed descriptions of ice formations, coastal measurements, and logistical challenges. This is what a working explorer's documentation actually looks like.
What about the idea that Byrd was silenced, that governments kept his real findings secret?
That claim shifts the burden of proof in a way that becomes impossible to test. If every missing document is proof of a cover-up, then absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence in reverse. But here's what scholars actually observe. Byrd published extensively. He gave interviews. He wrote books. His name remained prominent throughout his career. When governments do suppress information, there are usually traces. Former insiders come forward, declassified files emerge years later, patterns of restriction become visible. The Antarctic records show none of that. Byrd's later years did show changes, though. He became more interested in promoting Antarctic conservation and exploration than in rehashing his 1947 findings. He seemed focused on what came next, not on defending what came before. That behavioral shift, moving from immediate documentation to long-term vision, tells us something about how he saw his own work.
So as we weigh all of this, what would we need to see in primary records or physical data to accept claims this extraordinary? So, we've traced what we know about Operation Highjump, what the Navy documented, what experts can and cannot prove. But the real story doesn't end in archives or on declassified films. It travels into movies, novels, online videos, and into a diplomatic treaty signed by nations in 1959. Today, we follow those echoes and ask what happens when a documented expedition becomes a canvas for myth.
In the late 1950s, grainy 16mm newsreels flickered in American cinemas. Audiences had just lived through wartime rationing, and they were hungry for something else. Technological wonder, distant frontiers, proof that their nation could reach anywhere. The Navy obliged. Films like The Secret Land brought Antarctica home. Admiral Richard E. Byrd's photographic records and expedition footage became raw material for storytellers. Images of ice, mountains, and vast emptiness were exact and real. But once those images left the archive, they began to mean different things to different people. Science fiction writers picked up the thread. Books and later films imagined what lay beneath Antarctic ice. Lost civilizations, advanced technology, portals to somewhere else. None of this came from Highjump's actual findings, but Richard's name, his legacy as an explorer, gave these stories a sheen of plausibility.
That's a powerful pattern.
Meanwhile, on December 1st, 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. Its stated purpose was clear: preserve Antarctica for scientific cooperation and free it from military activity. It was a Cold War achievement, a place where superpowers agreed to compete through research, not weapons. But somewhere in the internet's vast conversation, a narrative took hold. The treaty, some began to claim, existed to hide what Highjump had found. There is no documentary evidence linking the treaty's signing to any discovery from 1947. The treaty's architecture and timing point to geopolitical strategy, not secrecy about a military expedition. Yet the story persisted because it fit a shape people wanted: authority hiding truth, governments protecting mysteries. Richard Byrd died in 1957, 2 years before the treaty. His visual record, carefully preserved and eventually made available to researchers and the public, became proof in the hands of both serious historians and conspiracy enthusiasts. The same photographs told different stories depending on who was looking and what they wanted to believe.
So, how did a documented scientific effort become a cultural touchstone for conspiracy? And what responsibility do we bear as storytellers? we've walked through the archives, the testimonies, and the competing claims about Admiral Richard E. Byrd's Antarctic expeditions. Now comes the harder question. What would actually change your mind about a story like this? Because the answer to that question shapes how we treat history itself.
Let's start with what we actually know. In late February 1947, Operation Highjump concluded. The expedition had documented Antarctic geography, tested equipment in extreme conditions, and gathered scientific data. Operation Windmill followed in 1947 and 1948, returning to establish ground control points for mapping. These were rigorous documented missions, with official records, photographs, and reports filed with the US Navy. Now, circulating online and in certain corners of popular culture is a very different story. That Byrd's fleet encountered and was defeated by Nazi flying saucers. That the encounter was covered up. That the evidence exists somewhere, hidden or suppressed. This narrative has genuine emotional pull. It combines mystery, Cold War anxiety, and the romance of unexplored frontiers into something that feels true, even when we cannot verify it.
But here's what matters. Feeling true is not the same as being true.
When we checked the most sensational quotes attributed to Byrd, we traced them backward. They first appeared in post-war publications, decades after the expeditions ended. Earlier, in official Navy records and contemporary newspaper accounts, those quotes simply did not exist. Primary documents matter because they are closest to the moment events actually occurred. They are harder to distort, though not impossible. Library catalogues and archival databases let you track where a claim originated. That detective work is unglamorous, but it is the foundation of honest historical inquiry. Richard Byrd was a real explorer who pushed into genuinely hostile environments. His documented achievements, the polar flights, the mapping, the winter survival, are extraordinary enough without embellishment. Yet his legacy has become a blank slate. People project onto it whatever mystery they need, and that's a loss, because when we distort his actual record, we diminish him. We also set a precedent. If we are willing to layer false narratives onto verified explorers, why should we trust any historical claim at all? The Antarctic Treaty, negotiated in 1959 and entered into force on June 23, 1961, designated Antarctica as a zone of scientific freedom and demilitarization. Territorial claims were frozen. Military activity was prohibited. That treaty is sometimes woven into conspiracy narratives, the idea that nations signed it to cover up what was really happening there. But read the treaty itself. It is a public document. Its stated purposes are explicit: freedom of scientific research, peaceful use, international cooperation. You can hold these two truths simultaneously. Treaties can be genuine, and people can misuse them in speculative fiction.
So what would evidence actually look like?
Start here. If extraordinary events occurred during those expeditions, you would expect to find contemporaneous documentation, official reports, weather logs, personnel records. From 1947, you would look for eyewitness testimonies recorded near the time, not decades later. You would search for physical artifacts, technical specifications, photographs taken on the ice. None of that materialized. Instead, the extraordinary claims rely on reinterpreted quotes, hearsay, and inference. When experts offered specific tests pointing to what would constitute credible evidence, the sources could not meet those standards. That does not prove nothing happened. It proves only that the case remains unsubstantiated. Here are practical steps you can take when you encounter similar claims. First, locate the original source. Where did this quote or story first appear? In what publication and when? Second, find primary documents, official records, unaltered archives, verified photographs. Third, note whether experts in the relevant field have examined the evidence, and if so, what they concluded. Fourth, Ask whether the narrative depends on hidden information or suppression. If credible proof exists only in secret, behind official walls, that is a claim you cannot evaluate. Real history sits in libraries and archives where anyone can verify it. Fifth, be honest about emotional resonance. Yes, the story is compelling. That is precisely why it spreads. But compulsion is not corroboration.
We respect Richard Byrd's legacy by treating his actual record with care. We respect the history of exploration by refusing to let it become a playground for unfounded speculation. The question we started with still stands. What evidence would you require to accept an extraordinary historical claim? And how can you find it?